I've had some weird experiences lately. Like when I was out in the park the other day, I found a dead cat and then I saw a man walking backwards.
It is true that the locking up the doors of people's houses and setting a watchman there night and day to prevent their stirring out or any coming to them, when perhaps the sound people in the family might have escaped if they had been removed from the sick, looked very hard and cruel.
I could give a great many such stories as these, diverting enough, which in the long course of that dismal year I met with, that is, heard of, and which are very certain to be true, or very near the truth, that is to say, true in the general, for no man could at such a time learn all the particulars.
The need to see people, my grandchildren, the need to, it sounds terrible, the need to see people outside Costa Coffee, I'll have a cigarette and have a coffee, just to see people walking around.
I've had this feeling as well, but I've had this feeling for absolutely decades. It's called institutionalization, where you get locked up and then you just get so used to being locked up that is the norm.
I've been on my own at home without any human contact whatsoever for other than Zooms since the 14th of March.
I haven't been able to act, sing, devise freely, and it's starting to send me up the fucking wall.
Anyway, I made this and I got into almost an argument which says it's like a spelling joke.
I feel even more trapped and isolated.
It's been 2 months and 7 days since I last saw you. On that Friday morning in March, a week before lockdown, as you left for work, we said our final goodbyes. A long walk with you is the first bit of fresh exercise I have had for weeks. You can meet someone from another household if they are vulnerable and need support. Technically that means us, as you are my carer and I am yours, as we have no family for support. Couples should decide whether they want to live apart or live together. So we made a choice to live apart, what with us only knowing fear and being alone due to our childhood trauma. I heard that Italian lovers in their country's lockdown made secret appointments to meet in supermarkets while shopping for their food. I would have done the same with you if we lived in the same area. So let's hide in the beautiful country parks, away from my town and away from your city, so the police cannot find us and tear us apart. We are Romeo and Juliet.
I went all the first part of the time freely about the streets, though not so freely as to run myself into apparent danger, except when they dug the great pit in the churchyard of our parish of Aldgate. A terrible pit it was, and I could not resist my curiosity to go and see it. As near as I may judge, it was about 40 feet in length, and about 15 or 16 feet broad, and at the time I first looked at it, about 9 feet deep. But it was said they dug it near 20 feet deep afterwards in one part of it, till they could go no deeper for the water. for they had, it seems, dug several large pits before this.
It was about the 10th of September that my curiosity led, or rather drove me, to go and see this pit again, where there had been near 400 people buried in it. And I was not content to see it in the daytime, as I had done before, for then there would have been nothing to have been seen but the loose earth, for all the bodies that were thrown in were immediately covered with earth by those they called the buriers, which at other times were called bearers. But I resolved to go in the night and see some of them thrown in.
There was a strict order to prevent people coming to those pits, and that was only to prevent infection. But after some time, that order was more necessary for people that were infected and near the end and delirious also would run to those pits wrapped in blankets or rugs and throw themselves in.
I got admittance into the churchyard by being acquainted with the sexton who attended, who, so he did not refuse me at all, yet earnestly persuaded me not to go, telling me very seriously,
Nay, if you will venture upon that score, name of God, go in, for, depend upon it, 'twill be a sermon to you. It may be the best that ever you heard in your life. 'Tis a speaking sight, and has a voice with it, and a loud one, to call us all to repentance. Go, if you will.
His discourse had shocked my resolution a little, and I stood wavering a good while. But just at that interval, I saw a pair of links coming over from the end of the Minories, and I heard the bellman, and then appeared a dead cart, as they called it, coming over the streets, and I could no longer resist my desire of seeing it, and went in.
There was nobody in the churchyard but the buriers and that fellow that led the horse and cart. But when they came up to the pit, they saw a man go to and again, muffled up in a brown cloak, and making motions with his hands under his cloak as if he was in great agony. And the buriers immediately gathered about him, supposing he was one of those poor, delirious or desperate creatures that used to pretend, as I have said, to bury themselves. He said nothing as he walked about, but 2 or 3 times groaned very deeply and loud, and sighed as if his heart would break.
When the buriers came up to him, they soon found he was neither a person infected and desperate, or a person distempered in mind, but oppressed with a dreadful weight of grief indeed, having his wife and several of his children all in the cart that was just come in with him, and he followed in an agony and excess of sorrow.
The bodies shot into the pit promiscuously, which was a surprise to him, for he at least expected they would have been decently laid in. No sooner did he see the sight, but he cried out aloud, unable to contain himself.
this was a mournful scene indeed.
All the lockdown rules have changed for me, not to be followed, not to be remembered. You see, they were the last thing on my mind when I was busy thinking of you. Your 9 lives ran out. Couldn't see you in hospital, as COVID says keep out of hospitals. They said no one could come in. Until the day I finally got to see you, intentionally dressed so lightly on a hot summer's day. I knew I didn't want to lose my breath or feel anxiety in my last moments with you under that full COVID armour. I tried not to sweat while I sat talking to you through a mask and shield, and touching your hand the last time as only allowed through latex gloves. I couldn't kiss you, even on the forehead, for fear that there may be contamination. Just had to say goodbye and then sanitize my hands as I left for the machine they call life support to decide on your fate. You told me you hated funerals and processes and everyone making a fuss. As someone living most of his life in the East End and having spent time homeless on the streets, where was the family and next of kin when you were struggling to pay rent and eat? They weren't there when you fought your battle with the DWP always cutting your benefits, or when you were self-harming or suicidal from that trauma they had responsibility for. So may God now rest your soul in peace. So here where I sit, X marks the spot, as this is where you took your last breath in the place you loved most.
Next to these public things were the dreams of old women, or I should say the interpretation of old women upon other people's dreams.
A little girl sits not far from me. She is about 4 years old, and she's wearing a white, flowery dress, and she's cleaning a basket. I look at her for a while, and then I get up from my chair and I go to the window. I look out of the window from behind a curtain. On the left side of the environment, there is a fair, bright colours, hats and stalls with bustling people coming and going. On the right side is a storm. There are people huddled together in a mass, children and women crying. The rain is lashing down. They are wet, they are crying. I think to myself, I can't help them. My house is not big enough. I look around my space. It will not hold all the women and children crying.
One morning, about 11 o'clock, I'd walked out to my brother's house in Coleman Street Parish, which I often did, to see that all was safe. My brother's house had a little court before it, and a brick wall, and a gate, and within that several warehouses where his goods of several sorts lay. It happened that in one of those warehouses were several packs of women's high-crowned hats, which came up out of the country, and were, as I suppose, for exportation. Whither, I know not.
I was surprised that when I came near my brother's door, which was in Swan Alley, I met 3 or 4 women with high-crowned hats on their heads, and one, if not more, had some hats likewise in their hands. As I didn't see them come out of my brother's door, and not knowing that my brother had any such goods in his warehouse, I did not offer to say anything to them, but I just went across the way to shun meeting them, as was usual to do at that time, for fear of the plague.
But when I came nearer to the gate, I met another woman with more hats coming out of the gate. "What business, mistress," said I, "have you had there?"
"There are more people there. I have had no more business there than they."
I was hasty to get to the gate then and said no more to her, by which means she got away. But just as I came to the gate, I saw 2 more come across the yard to come out, also with hats on their heads and under their arms, at which I threw the gate to behind me, which, having a spring lock, fastened itself, and turning to the women, "Forsooth," said I, "what are you doing here?" and seized upon the hats and took them from them. One woman, who I confess did not look like a thief, said,
"Indeed we are wrong, but we were told that they were goods that had no owners. Feel free to take them back again, and look yonder, there are other customers such as we."
She cried and looked pitifully, so I took the hats from her, opened the gate and bade them begone, for I pitied the women. But when I looked towards the warehouse, as she had directed, I saw 6 or 7 more, all women, all fitting themselves with hats, as quietly and unconcerned as if they had been in a hatter's shop buying for their money.
I was surprised, not at the sight of so many thieves only, but at the circumstances I was in, being now to thrust myself in among so many people, who for some weeks had been so shy of myself that if I met anybody in the street, I would cross the way from them.
Even at this time, the plague was so high as that there died 4,000 a week.
so that in showing my resentments, or even in seeking justice for my brother's goods, I might lose my own life.
Then I talked a little upon another foot with them, and asked them how they could do such things as this in a time of such general calamity, and as it were, in face of God's most dreadful judgments, when the plague was at their very doors, and it may be at their very houses, and they did not know, but that the death cart might stop at their doors in a few hours to carry them to their graves.
Swept 100,000 souls.